So yeah, I probably will try to hit some high points today. I know a lot of you are, have other things that you're doing and you want to hear some interesting discussion, but I really want to talk a little bit, maybe just a few minutes about myself, a little bit about how I came into this ministry that I'm involved with right now, and then a little bit about some of the things that are happening right now in Wilmington. There are a number of really, really exciting ministry opportunities going on right now, right here in the Wilmington area. And I would hesitate to say there aren't many places that I'm aware of in this country that have the kind of Christian ministry activities that we do here. So I want to share a little bit of that with you, and also share a little bit about how I got involved with some of them, and then really kind of open it up just for questions or discussion, just to get some feedback from you. You know, as Bob said, it is right now, and I think I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, it's a hostile environment out there today, especially for a young person, but even for folks that are maybe not that young anymore, to espouse or to hold true to a Christian worldview, a biblical Christian worldview, is under attack like it's never been under attack before. In the past, I think maybe many of you can recall, depending on how long you have been a believer, I can remember, 30 some odd years ago sharing my faith with a fellow student at NC State. And most of the time, I don't know what your experience has been, you would, depending on the person, you would probably get sort of a neutral or sort of a non-response. You might get a, well, okay, I'll think about it, or well, maybe that's okay for you, but I'm not so sure I want to do that Christian thing. But it was a somewhat neutral response, unless the person, of course, accepted Christ, in which case we rejoice. But what we see today is that there really is not much neutrality anymore. And it is actually a hostile environment when you share the gospel with people. I know that sounds kind of strange to say, but there really is very little neutrality anymore. I think you probably can relate to the fact that we've become very polarized in our society and our culture, especially on the political spectrum, but even on the theological, philosophical spectrum, things have become very polarized. And so I think being able to have good discussions with people who don't share your worldview, but with whom you want to share the biblical gospel message is just so important today. And so I want to give you some things that we're doing with the ministry I'm involved with, plus a couple of other really good ministries here in Wilmington, and really encourage you to get involved with those or ask about them. We would love to get your support and help. So, okay, I'll keep an eye on the time. So, John Zino, kind of an interesting story, like many of you. Was an unbeliever for a good majority of my life growing up. Accepted Christ at a young age. Was about 14, but didn't really understand what I had done. I was born and raised in New York, so not a lot of what I would call classic biblical influence in my life. A lot more Catholicism was a much more predominant view. And so we were down on vacation here at Myrtle Beach back in 1978. It was actually Easter Sunday. And I had gone to, there was a ministry group that was actually a college ministry group that had come and had music, and they presented the gospel, and I asked Christ to be my Lord and Savior that day. But never really understood what it meant or what the implications or ramifications from that were. Went back home, really never gave it much of a second thought. I didn't even own a Bible. I hardly ever went to church. And so it was one of those things that never really quite made sense as I was coming up through my teenage and high school years. As Bob said, I went to NC State as an undergrad and met a nice young lady who I started to date and spend time with. And she, on the contrary, was an incredibly strong Christian believer. Was raised in a very strong Christian family. And pretty much said, if you want to keep dating me, you're going to be going to church with me on Sunday morning. And I can tell by a few of you laughing that you probably had some experience maybe similar to that. And as she, and I literally mean dragged me to church on Sunday, I started to hear the gospel message again for the first time, if that makes any sense. And it began to start to make sense what had happened to me a number of years earlier. And so then, after talking with her and talking with her pastor, recognized that, yes, indeed, I did have that experience, but I didn't really know what to make of it at the time. So I kind of view that as sort of the starting point of my journey of faith, recognizing I was still 19 or 20 years old. I was in college at the time, but never really understood what it meant. But it was at that point, in fact, she bought me a Bible for that Christmas, Christmas of '84, I think, or '85. So I got my first King James Bible and started to read it. And I think that's where I would really sort of put the marker in the ground as to when I started to really begin to sort of take hold of this thing we call Christianity and sort of, own my own belief system, my own faith. I don't know what your experiences have been, but I think what we see a lot with college students today is they tend to co-opt the Christian worldview of their parents, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but whenever they do get challenged or they find themselves in a difficult situation, they sometimes find it hard to be able to articulate the why behind the what, because they've sort of adopted this view from mom and dad or maybe their pastor, and a lot of times they struggle when they're challenged with basic ideas of things that are seen in the Bible. And that's about where I was at their age, in my early 20s, as I was studying the Bible and learning it. Never really understood what it meant as I began to go through and read it. And it's kind of embarrassing to have to admit this, but at the time I was working toward a master's and eventually a doctoral degree. I really didn't start truly owning my faith and studying the Bible and studying Christianity until about 4 or 5 years after I had finished my PhD, which is really a sad statement. And I try to communicate this to the students with whom we speak. Don't do what I did. Don't wait that long. Read your Bible, study, get in a group of young like-minded believers and really mine the scriptures and ask those hard questions and dig and study the history of Christianity. The history is so rich and so deep. And study subjects like philosophy and theology and understand worldviews and even other religious views so that when you're confronted with them, you can articulate, oh, well, that's the reason I don't hold that view correct. Let me tell you about this thing called Christianity and why this really is what's true. And again, that's very offensive today, to kind of suggest that somebody else's view is false. Oh my goodness, hater, bigot, right? But that's what we're up against today. I mean, if Christianity really is true, that seems to imply that all the other views are not true, right? Because Jesus either is God, was the second person of the Trinity, or he wasn't. And if he was, then Christianity is true, but that means Islam is false, Judaism, all the other Eastern religious views, Mormonism, I mean, they're all of the other ones can't be true, right? And this is a hard message today because we live in a very pluralistic society where everybody wants to sort of acknowledge everybody's correct, right? And that's a hard thing to do when you're talking to folks in our society today, to kind of say, yeah, I'm listening to you, but you know what? That view you hold really isn't correct. But let me give you the reasons why I think Christianity is the correct worldview. And it makes the most sense of the data. And it explains everything we've seen and everything we see today. And so it really began for me, even about 2005, 2006, as I really started to study and dig deep into this thing we call Christianity, the Christian theology, right? Understanding the Christian concept of God. And the Trinity, very interesting topic to discuss and a subject to think about. A lot of people get confused with that topic. They have a hard time articulating it, particularly to an unbeliever. And so these are the kind of things that I think are so important today when we try to communicate the truth of the Christian message to unbelievers or to skeptics or to atheists or to people that are just generally secularists and very hostile toward any religion. Any religious view today is viewed very skeptically. And so it's a different environment today. And particularly for our young folks, if you have children or maybe grandchildren, I'm telling you, they are in a battle like none like I've ever seen, and I would imagine maybe none like any of you have seen. In the battle of ideas, it is a very hostile environment. And so, as Bob indicated, I had worked with, in about 2011, maybe 10 or 11, a ministry called Ratio Christi emerged, actually at Appalachian State in Boone, and it was centered around this idea of Christian apologetics. Now, that term may or may not be familiar to you. When we introduce it to folks, the first response we get is, well, why are you apologizing for Christianity? Right? And it kind of sounds like that. But actually, it's a legal term. I don't know if any of you recall when you were in school reading something called Socrates' Apology, right? From the ancient Greek philosophers. Socrates' defense when he was on trial for his life. He gave his apology, his defense, right? I make my students read that, by the way, at UNCW. That's the first thing we read is Socrates' Apology, because I want them to get used to the idea of what does it mean to be an apologist, to defend something. In the case of Socrates, he was defending himself. But in the case of Christianity, we are defending the Christian faith. We're giving evidences and reasons for the Christian faith. And so Ratio Christi started early, I guess 2000, maybe it was 2010, 9 or 10, and came to UNCW in 2011 with a guy named Aaron Marshall, who started, he was the first chapter director. A guy named Tom Jaski, who has spoken here before, also joined him. Tom is now the chapter director for the UNCW chapter. Aaron's gone on to open up multiple Ratio Christi college chapters at universities in Utah, where there's a very strong Mormon presence at schools like Utah State, BYU, and actually being a Christian apologist, a Christian minister in a very Mormon-dominated society and culture. So spreading the gospel using apologetics. And so that got me involved with Ratio Christi. I began to speak and be engaged with and involved with the students. It's a very strong student ministry. We are trying our best to use it as a platform to reach the faculty at UNCW. I've been teaching there since 2018, and we are trying to use this as also a tool or a way of reaching faculty with the gospel message. Boy, you talk about a tough crowd there. You think the students are tough. But this is what we're up against. This is what we see today. I'm going to be teaching at NC State in the fall, and we're going to do the same thing there. I'm partnering with Ratio Christi has a chapter at NC State as well, and so I'm going to be partnering with them this fall while I'm up there occasionally teaching, and then teaching remotely as well. But to sort of finish the story, in about 2018, we formed a separate ministry from Ratio Christi called Coastal Apologetics Network, and that was the slide I had up here on the screen a minute ago. Oh, well, I guess it locked me out here. Hold on. There we go. So this ministry was formed in 2018, and can you see it? And the goal of this ministry was to take what was going on the college campuses, thank you, and start to spread it outside of the university campuses. So to churches, to youth groups, to work with pastors and other ministers in the local area with this idea of Christian apologetics. And so in my remaining time, I do want to just kind of walk through very quickly, just so you have some background on this, because I think it's important to understand sort of the historical context before I begin to speak, but I also want to share with you some of what it looks like in practical reality. So one of the things we try to emphasize when we talk to folks about the need for sharing your faith in a very, very secular, postmodern culture, and what we've seen is that as Christians, we need to start thinking about adapting the way we look at missions, particularly missions in this country. Now, recognizing that there are numerous people that have done a great job with foreign missions, going to remote places, sharing the gospel with third world nations and countries and peoples, and have been incredibly effective. The idea of the 1040 window, I'm sure you've heard of that. That was a big thing in the 90s. Sharing the gospel with folks outside the U.S. Well, what we've started to see is that when the gospel message is now pivoted toward a first world culture, the United States, Canada, countries in Europe, the playing field starts to change. Because when you start to witness and minister to folks in this culture, you run into obstacles that you don't always run into with the group on the first slide. You find people that are very, very skeptical, very cynical about any sort of religious view, very much turned off by either a bad experience with a church or a pastor. In fact, what you find are people who are actually quite familiar with the gospel message, right? With the first group, the first slide I showed, in many cases, this is the first time they're hearing the gospel message. But when you go to a group like this, chances are they've heard the gospel before. They know who Jesus is. You're not really surprising them with that idea. But they've already decided to put it behind them. They're skeptical, they're cynical, they're agnostic, or even atheistic, or pluralistic, where, yep, that's fine if you want to believe it, but, you know, all religions are true, all paths to God are the same. These are kind of hard things to deal with because you don't necessarily encounter these things in the traditional mission field, but you do in this mission field. And so what we're seeing is the need to equip not just college students, but all believers with the ability to be able to address and discuss and witness and minister to that group of people, to those group of people, to the guy at the gas station, the woman at the grocery store, your next door neighbor. I'd be shocked if you started speaking to somebody in Wilmington and began to share the gospel and talk about Jesus. I'd be shocked if they said, "Really, Jesus? Never heard of him." Everybody's heard of him in this country. That's the problem. Everybody's heard of him. And they've already made up in their mind this false idea about what Christianity is, and they've put it behind them. So you're having to unravel months, years, maybe even decades of really bad thinking in a 5-minute conversation. Not easy to do. Not easy to do. So what we're really starting to see is the need to be able to equip Christian believers, and again, not just college students, you, me, people in our society, people that are believers. How do you address this? There was a fascinating article that came out back in 2019, the Barna Group. I'm guessing you've probably heard of the Barna Group. They do a lot of these surveys in Christianity. They had an article on the top 100 most post-Christian cities in America. Now, what's a post-Christian? What's post-Christianity? Post-Christianity is pretty much exactly as it sounds. It's a society that has been completely permeated with the gospel message to the point where a vast majority of people have just turned the off switch. They've just flipped the switch off and don't want to hear it anymore. They're beyond Christianity. They're post-Christian. And again, this would be most first world nations. Thank you. Now, what was fascinating about this is if you look at the list, Wilmington was the #1 city in the entire state of North Carolina for the most post-Christian worldview. Higher than Raleigh, higher than Durham, higher than Chapel Hill, higher than Charlotte. In fact, Wilmington was the #1 city in the entire southeastern United States, higher than Atlanta, Richmond, higher than all of these other cities. 47%. You know what that means? For the most part, 1 out of every 2 people you meet in this town hold a view of Christianity that they've already put out of their mind and they don't even want to talk about it or think about it anymore. 1 out of every 2 people, almost half, are beyond Christianity, post-Christian. You got to know how to interact with these people. You got to know how to talk to these people. Because don't get me wrong, I love Scripture, I love the Bible. John 3:16, one of my favorite verses. But when you're dealing with people that have a post-Christian mindset, it's going to be a challenge to get them to see beyond all these things that they've already decided, because they have bad mental pictures of Christianity. And it's hard to overcome that just by giving them a Bible verse or 2. So there's a lot more at stake here. And so what we've started to see is, as Christians, we need to be able to defend the faith that we hold to. Be able to defend and give good reasons and good evidences. This is apologetics. Every Christian is an apologist. If you believe that the Bible is divinely inspired by God, then you believe 1 Peter 3:15. You are called to be an apologist. You're called to give a defense. So we're all apologists, whether you realize it or not. Now the question is, are you a good apologist? Or are you a not so good apologist? Are you a good defender, or are you kind of a so-so defender? And we really emphasize this, again, with the students, but also with folks that are in the community as well, our Christian leaders, our church members. We've got to be able to be compelling, to be able to talk to the world about this. Because look, 1 out of every 2 people in this town need to hear this. They need to hear this. And so this is where we have come. We currently partner with Ratio Christi. I think I mentioned that. Every fall, we have thousands of new students on campus. Talk about a mission field. Oh my goodness, right? We try to reach these students. We find, interestingly enough, that there are a lot of students that were raised in a Christian worldview or a Christian home. But as they get to college, they tend to sort of fall away because they've never really been given the tools needed to address all of the challenges that they face. And so part of what we're trying to do is with Ratio Christi, and again, we're partnered with them to help with this, to help them to see the message of the gospel.